Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in European Politics. I'm Tim Jones, and my guest today is Jade McGlynn, author of Russia's War, published in March by Polity Press. Quote, "There can be no justification for what Russia is doing now or what it has been doing in Ukraine since 2014, she writes. And yet many Russians do justify, even approve the war. It is their war, Russia's war, not Putin's alone. A year into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and 9 years since its annexation of Crimea and occupation of Ukraine's Far East, why are Russians still behind this brutal and disastrous project? Where are the mass protests? Why hasn't Putin been removed?" In her new book, based on a decade of research into Russia's politics of memory and propaganda, and close to 60 post-invasion interviews with prominent Russians, Dr. McGlynn explains why. Jade McGlynn is a research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She completed a DPhil at Oxford, where she also lectured on Russia. A frequent contributor to the BBC, Deutsche Welle, The Telegraph and The Spectator, her next book, Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia, will be published by Bloomsbury Press in June. Jade, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned in the intro there, you've got another book coming out in just 3 months. And in the introduction to this book, you talk about the strain of getting 2 books out and this one being done in just 5 months. Did you feel you had to get this one done and specifically about the war to coincide with the anniversary of the invasion?
No, not at all. They weren't written in parallel. I had submitted Memory Makers before the war even began. But as ever with a book project and with the PhD, there was a lot of material in there that I hadn't used and that sort of played on my mind. But I sort of put it to the back of my mind, not least because I had a baby just 2 months before the full-scale invasion occurred. And it was really... I had no intention of writing the book. I didn't particularly want to write this book, but I realized that everybody was going to be writing books, and a lot of it bluntly was going to be based on opinion. And I felt that I had important research that had been conducted that had something meaningful to add to the debate.
Well, yeah, I think it does do that, because I mean the question people are constantly asking is why. As I said at the beginning, why do Russians not stand up and do something about this? And what is the thinking behind it? I've got one other question on process, though. How did you pick your interviewees and how did you conduct the conversations?
Mm-hmm. So I picked those interviewees. There's a mix. There's obviously a lot of ordinary people whose names I chose to pseudonymize, even if they were happy to be named, because that seemed not ethical, and there were also sort of more prominent Russians where their positions were already public knowledge. So and often these were quite pro-war positions, though not always. And in general, I picked comments from prominent Russians that I felt were reflective of, I suppose, like a school of thought, either within influential intellectual circles or within the public at large, or because I felt the analysis was strong. From ordinary Russians, those people are often people that I have long-standing relationships with, and so that I've been in conversation with about this and similar topics since probably 2015, if not even slightly earlier in some pieces.
Yeah. Well, coming to the book itself, at the heart of the book is what you call a paradox whereby Russians regard this war as, quote, existential but ignorable. Can you explain how this is possible?
Yes. So when I talk about that paradox, I mean, I don't think that most Russians do see the war as existential, and I make that argument sort of just before this quote. I do think that the Russian government, which has made a big effort and has fallen for its own propaganda here, I think has conflated itself with the nation, and I think that it sees the war as existential. But if we look at some of the quite interesting opinion polls that show that Russian, sort of 60% of Russians would be happy to continue, would support continuing the war over the longer term, but a similar number would also support peace negotiations tomorrow. It reminds us that often for many Russians, they will interpret such questions as not what is your own personal view, but would you support Putin or the government in doing this? And so in a way, it's that sense that they of a lack of political agency. But where the war is existential is for the Putin regime. They may see themselves as Russia. I don't think that there's any sort of rational understanding where this war is existential for Russia as a state. Clearly, it's existential for Ukraine. But the more that there is this insistence within the propaganda that this is the case, and that sort of Russia cannot exist, cannot be whole or ontologically secure without Ukraine, the more this is likely to turn the terrible fantasy into reality.
Your description about how the government exerts power is really interesting, and you say that people talk casually about the state being, or the regime being fascist or totalitarian, whereas in fact it's more just of an autocracy, or it was before. And you describe this through the framework of a spectrum of allies model, essentially rule through a sort of form of apathy. Can you talk us through that idea and how it applies to Russia?
Yes, so I very much am still of the opinion. I mean, I don't like the term totalitarian anyway, but even if we say, okay, that's a workable shorthand for referring to a place like the Soviet Union under Stalin or Nazi Germany, where they almost want to reinvent man, that's not the case for Russia. I mean, you could not make any sorts of comparisons with Stalinist era repressions, or indeed with Soviet level ambitions for recreating and recasting mankind. Russia is an authoritarian country where you have a sort of one man or a small elite that's, if we use Linda's sort of definition, you have one man, a small elite that have a lot of power that's often ill-defined but predictable. They don't really try to mobilize people. They don't have a guiding ideology, and they use repression and other measures to keep political opposition manageable. And this is where I find the spectrum of allies. And I think that it is a contribution to the debate of how the propaganda works. Because again, going back to these maybe tendencies of in democratic countries of what life is like in an authoritarian country, sometimes you often get the impression that, sort of if only Russian people would hear the truth, then they would completely change their minds, and then they would know. But obviously that's not the case, and I also don't think it's the case that people are brainwashed either. If 40 million Russians have Telegram, they can use it. It's completely uncensored. They don't need a VPN to use it. And yet 18 of the top 20 political Telegram channels are pro-war. And even the awful censorship that does exist now in Russian media, it's far from totalizing. You still have access to YouTube, but that only came in on the 3rd of March, very early March in 2022. I mean, the war started in 2014. People haven't had access to a lot of media all that time. So I think as well, there needs to be a sense of proportion. But if we go on to the spectrum of allies, my main argument here is essentially that the Russian government is not interested, of course, in trying to convince the active opposition. They even want to make them apathetic or just get rid of them. And of course, there's a range of ways, from encouraging them to leave to sort of harrowing forms of poison, as we know. Then with the apathetic people, they try to sort of nudge them along, or the propaganda, the state-aligned media tries to nudge them along into a sense of my country, right or wrong. So that idea that maybe I don't 100% agree with everything that the government is doing or everything about the war, but it's my country. I don't have many others. And I'm going to stand by. And I have to say, I know quite a few people where sanctions, and in particular, sort of the framing of sanctions and the sort of lines around Russophobia, and Russian government's claims of Russophobia did help to nudge them from the apathetic into the my country, right or wrong category. And then people who are in the my country, right or wrong category, they may over time be nudged into the sort of ritual support category. And those are the people where the propaganda narratives, they resonate, they land, and, people have these views, but they have them and they sort of support the government rather than supporting a specific policy and happening to be in alignment with the government. That is to say, they stay within an acceptable sphere of support. And what I mean by that is that the government, unlike perhaps in a, for a pressure group, which would love active support, the Kremlin is very suspicious of active support. This is why it we've seen arrests of people who've come out protesting for the war, as in support of the war, just celebrating the government. And it's because such people are a bit unmanageable, because when things don't go to plan, and a lot hasn't gone to plan in this war, you can't necessarily rely on such people, because their loyalty, it's not for the government, it's for the cause.
Yeah, you do make it clear a couple of times that you understand why people don't want to protest. That you talk about this one woman who I can't remember what it was now, but one individual protested and she ended up doing 10 years in a Labour colony. But at the same time, you make this really interesting point about the 500,000 people who've left since last August, and there've been no mass protests among this diaspora. How do you explain that?
I suppose just quickly to pick up on the Sasha Sputnyanka point. So she is facing that. She's still sort of awaiting trials, but that is what she's facing, is 10 years. She hasn't been sentenced yet. Her case is ongoing right now. But yes, so that sense of apathy of, it's not going to make much difference. And of course, things like opinion polls, in that sense that everybody else isn't on your side, of course that contributes to a sense of the pointlessness of protesting alongside the fear. And, I have to be honest, especially, I think, for parents, when you see, there's been a number of cases where children have been taken off parents and sent to orphanages. As somebody who spent some time working in a Russian orphanage, I have to say I wouldn't protest the war if there was that risk for my children. So I think it's important. I hope I do this in the book. I think it's important to sometimes pose ourselves these questions, because it's very easy to sit in the UK and ask, why aren't people protesting? But I think it's important to pose those questions of what would you honestly do if those were the levels of risk, for you. And I hope my answer there has been honest. Now, in terms of the protests abroad, I have to say, since on the 1 year anniversary, there were a number of protests, though I'm not sure. I think it would be difficult to describe any of them as mass protests, but they were sort of a bit larger in number, and that was encouraging. In general, I think the reason why we haven't seen these protests is because, and this is a point that comes through in the book, I think there are two elements to this answer. One of them is that the oppositional, well, actually maybe there's three. One, not everybody who left is necessarily opposed to the war. They may just not like sanctions. I mean, that's entirely, reasonable. Or maybe they don't like the means of the war, but they're not necessarily against the ends, i.e. sort of destroying or occupying Ukraine. Secondly, the opposition is defined, or the Russian opposition and diaspora has always, struggled to become a coherent force, even if we look back at the sort of emigre communities, and they've always struggled to really kind of adapt into the politics of the different communities have struggled to adapt into the politics of the host community, and have often sort of pursued their own ends, which gradually over time, with the Soviet Union not collapsing, obviously, for quite a while, they became increasingly less relevant. And I do think there's a worry that could happen again. because there's this sense of everybody sitting in a waiting room waiting for the Putin regime to collapse. And, what about if it doesn't? Will it be? And then thirdly, I think the issue is that this Ukrainophobia that exists within Russian culture, I think it runs through a fair amount of strands of Russian liberal thought as well. I think there's a real social racism, as the sociologist Jeremy Morris calls it, that sense of that there's two Russias, that there's one enlightened Western Russia that's European, and then there's this other sort of, a horde of Russians who are unenlightened, and, they have this slave mentality. And I find that distinction, I find it quite repulsive, if I'm honest. And I think it doesn't get us anywhere to understanding, Russians and the broad mass of Russian people, because there are just two groups of good Russians, bad Russians. And that sort of thinking is one of the reasons why, until Navalny, it was a struggle for much of the liberal opposition to cut through and speak to people.
Yeah, in fact, you mentioned a point after a number of the interviews that you're infuriated by people who are more bothered by the way Tolstoy is being treated rather than the bombing of Ukrainian universities. Is that something you came across frequently? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it really is. And I have to say also, not just by Russians, and maybe for some background for listeners. So I taught myself Russian when I was 12 because I wanted to be able to read Dostoevsky in the original. I say in the book, to my mind, Russian literature is unparalleled. I mean, I think it's wonderful. I certainly don't want Russian literature cancelled at all. I taught Russian. I studied Russian literature at Oxford. I then went on to teach the sort of Russian literature intellectual history course, sort of modules, rather. So I'm coming at this from a position not from the outside, but very much from the inside of that Russianist space, if we can call it that. And I find it utterly infuriating that there is this huge focus on whether or not this or that Dostoevsky course has been cancelled in the West, but also particularly where there's a focus on it in Ukraine, because I mean, first of all, I admire the chutzpah of somebody who feels they can sit in judgment over a country that is defending itself from a sort of genocidal onslaught aimed at destroying their culture and their identity, and want to talk about, why they've cancelled the, Tchaikovsky or whatnot. But secondly, when we come back to look just at the Western side, I don't really see any evidence of this happening in a serious way. What I do see, and I find this very, very worrying, is a tendency in some countries to target individual Russians who don't have any official links or anything to do with the regime. So I know in Germany, for example, there have been several cases where students have been told that they're not welcome to come and do their PhD in Germany simply because they are Russian. And I think this is outrageous, especially when we think of some of the other people who may be welcome, in Germany and their links to German businesses. And it's not just Germany. I don't want to pick on Germany. It's not an anti-German point. There are many other European countries doing similar things. So again, I find this idea of talking around abstract things. I mean, bluntly, I love Dostoevsky. I think everybody should read Dostoevsky, but Dostoevsky's dead. He's been dead for a long time, and it's important that we worry about the living. I mean, this is not of all of the issues that are completely urgent to deal with, Dostoevsky isn't one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this does bring us to the broader question which you answer in this book, throughout this book, which is around Russian exceptionalism and how essential Ukraine is to that self-definition. Can you talk us through that and touch on this intriguing character, Lev Kobylev?
So I think one of the elements that's sometimes overlooked, particularly when it comes to defining Russia's war as a war of imperialism, is this particular obsession and the particular place of Ukraine within Russia's own sort of social and political imagination, if you will, of itself and of the country surrounding it. So Of course, that's not to say it isn't an imperial war, but it's an imperial war plus something else, plus a bit extra. And we saw in Vladimir Putin's 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, he sort of depicted Ukraine as a non-nation, a region, a subset of a borderland of Russia. But worse than that, he depicts Ukrainian identity, sort of like Ukraine's or like Ukrainianness, as a weapon, something created artificially by the West to use to destroy Russia. And this mindset, I think, in this opinion, is very important to understanding this sense that Ukrainian nationalism, which is essentially anything in this interpretation, is anything that doesn't want to be politically subjugated and controlled by Moscow. They view Ukrainian nationalism as a sort of a direct affront, but also a direct threat to Russia's conception of itself as a great power, and Russia's conception of itself as a separate civilization. And there are many, many different reasons for this, but one of the key reasons goes back to the many disputes around Kiev and Rus, and the sort of historiographical disputes of who is the inheritor of Kiev and Rus. And it's quite central, even going back to sort of Ivan III and the takeover of Novgorod, it's quite essential to tellings of Russian history that Russia and that Moscow is perceived as the inheritor of this territory. And I think if we go back to the Kopylyev, the dissident, the famous Soviet dissident that you referenced, and I talk about, and I draw very heavily on Daria Matimali's very fascinating, impeccable research into the Holodomor. This, I suppose, links our earlier discussion around points of liberalism and also broader attitudes, not just in the pro-Putin sort of what appears to be pro-Putin majority towards Ukraine, but also among those who might see themselves as, or might present themselves as Western. And this, obviously a lot of people won't have read the book, so I'll just sort of briefly explain who on earth I'm talking about. So Lev Kopylyev was a famous dissident, fated by Western intellectuals, Russian intelligentsia, very active in the Soviet human rights movements, after he was imprisoned because he protested violations of German civilians' rights after World War II. So seen as sort of a moral high ground, still is. Very much so. But long before all of that, in 1929, Lev was working in the countryside of Kharkiv Oblast, and in some areas that are now part of Kherson Oblast as well. And he was he was taking part in the Soviet policy of collectivization. And if we look back at his memoirs, as Dr. Mattingly has done, we see that there's a lot of things that don't add up. He says, okay, well, there was no gunshots fired, there was no sort of blood spill, and he doesn't mention his involvement at all in such sort of dispossession. And he just talks about the non-violent eviction of a priest, which doesn't really make sense when we can see from the archives that Lev had to flee the village with the chairman of the local collective farm and others because of, the unrest that was happening, and peasants were throwing stones at the group, and he was unable to return, and then went to the village near Prakhovka in Kherson Oblast, where there's been a significant amount of fighting. And the issue here is that in these memoirs, Lev not only, or Dr. Kopylyev, not only demonstrates no regret for his involvement, but he actually, whereas others tried to sort of save the children from starving. So, for example, he claims when he was in Kakhovka that he didn't see anybody starving to death at the time, which seems very unlikely given that, according to Dr. Matuli, 2,050 people died in a small village of Kabivka from between 1932 and 1933, and 4 orphanages had to be opened in the village. But somehow he worked enforcing collectivization and didn't notice this. And he continued to demand the last grains from families. A lot of others are on record as having tried to help the starving children or found a way just to escape from doing the job. But actually, Liev decided to return to what he referred to as the grain front in March 1933. And when asked sort of later on, why, he, which wasn't something he was asked very often because people didn't see it as a huge issue, he just said, well, I was a true believer and I really thought I was saving the nation. But I mean, I don't care what you think you believe. If you can see starving, crying children with round bellies from starvation, if you watch them die, I don't understand how this man can still be known as a great humanist or a wonderful dissident who represents the highest ideals of humanity, when the mass killing of the Ukrainian peasantry provoked zero empathy in him. And not only that, he was part of it. I mean, he obviously participated in it. So what does that say about society and even the liberal section of society when participating in a man-made famine that killed millions of Ukrainians? This doesn't prevent your access to these sort of hallowed pools of humanist heroes. I think it shows the extent to which Ukrainian suffering, when inconvenient, is seen as ignorable or seen as something that can be sacrificed at the altar of Russian storytelling about themselves.
Yeah, I mean, in that respect, you refer to Putin. I don't remember. You either refer to Putin or Putinism as historical, as a historical nationalist rather than as a nationalist, and you stress the critical importance of this whole narrative of the Great Patriotic War that conveniently starts in 1941. Could you talk us through that, the central importance of this national myth or national story?
So, I mean, this is something that I explore in much more detail in Memory Makers that is out in June. But very broadly, it's not just the history itself, though that is very much sort of underpinned by the notion that Russia has always been a great power, special power, since its inheritance given Rus, since it became the third Rome after the fall of Constantinople. But that then during the Great Patriotic War, which is the name for the Soviet Nazi war, the Nazi war against the Soviet Union, that they sort of reiterated this right, and they reasserted this right, and the post-Yalta settlement, which of course gave Russia sort of dominion over its, what it would call its near abroad, or what Russians would call their near abroad, to countries like in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, and Ukraine, of course. That this is something that to not allow Russia this is actually to disrespect the memory of World War II. It's actually, to be a Nazi. And that's why you see Russians sometimes calling people Nazis, for reasons that don't seem entirely clear. Their understanding of Nazism is very linked to this. And we can talk in more detail, but essentially it's linked to the de-ideologization of communism under Putin, where it's very nostalgized. There's a lot of nostalgia of the Soviet Union, but reading the narratives, and I have to say I read tens of thousands of articles in Russian media on this, you would almost forget that this was a communist period, because there's no real reference to the actual communism. Instead, it's just seen as the Soviet Union as a great power, as a sort of stable force that represented both a threat and an alternative to the West, but the communism is kind of glossed over. And this sense of national exceptionalism is incredibly important, but so too is the constant spectre of trauma and tragedy and times of trouble, such as the 1990s or the revolutions and the Civil War, sort of from 1917 to 1922, or indeed the original time of troubles following issues of succession to the throne that long story short, led to a brief occupation by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So this idea that when Russia is weak, its enemies from the West will take advantage and sort of sow further chaos. So the state of Russia as a state must always be strong. It plays an important role.
Mm-hmm. Well, coming more up to date, I knew NATO's Kosovo intervention had been important in restarting the Cold War, but until I read your book, I hadn't realised how fundamental it was to the reemergence of illiberalism and revanchism in Russia. Can you explain?
Yes, you're right. And it's I mean, admittedly, not sort of funny in a ha-ha way, but it's odd because I don't think it's really remembered at all much. Say in the UK, I mean, I happen to have always been interested in it because when I studied Russian, I studied Serbian as part of my kind of Slavonic languages degree. But so I've always kind of understood maybe more about it. But in Russia, in particular, the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999 is a crucial point of departure in the geopolitical mind map. And the mainstream Russian understanding of the conflict is quite different from that of many Western countries who would see it as a humanitarian intervention that prevented or was even a response to an ongoing genocide. And there's, in Western accounts, there's very little emphasis on the lack of UN Security Council approval for airstrikes or the loss of civilian lives or the use of depleted uranium or the bombings of, the media buildings and of the Chinese embassy, of course, which the Chinese obviously remember. So if you look at the Russian side, or the sort of Russian historical, say, for example, the history portals or the history websites that are popular in Russia, you would understand that the crisis in Kosovo was not caused by Slobodan Milosevic deliberately stirring up nationalist tensions, but really by the USA, by NATO, and some EU countries who were exploiting Russia's post-Soviet weakness and deliberately destroying Serbia, with whom it has this kind of historical relationship. And I think what's important here, and is something that I really don't think is referenced enough, is that, of course, a lot of the language around NATO is an exaggeration, and it focuses on this sense that almost NATO has moved into Eastern Europe rather than asking why everybody on Russia's borders wanted to join NATO. But it is worth bearing in mind that, the first phase of NATO expansion started in 1999, so in February, and you had Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic joining. And then I think it was 2, maybe 3 weeks later when the first military operation in its history. And so with this expansion, we have NATO going from a defensive to an aggressive alliance, at least in the Russian perspective. And I have to be honest, I can certainly see where that perspective comes from. And so even though we can all say until we're blue in the face, like, okay, that, NATO is a defensive alliance, if you look at it from the Russian perspective, and you don't have to agree, but it's just important to understand their perspective, they see it as NATO began to expand and then it began to go to war, and it had never been to war before. So I guess it's paranoia around NATO, in my view, but I definitely see why that paranoia has been stoked.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never made the connection between that first enlargement and the attack on Kosovo before. It was, as you say, you could see why some people would think would make that connection. Mm-hmm. Coming to the current war, 2 things you wrote really jumped out at me, and I'll start with this one. You said that Russian officials thought the invasion would be a more complex version of the Kazakhstan intervention, and this was kind of what Silvio Berlusconi got into trouble for saying a few months ago. The idea that it would just be a surgical intervention into Kiev, quote, denazification, installation of a friendly government, and out again within 4 months. That's amazing. I mean, is that something you came across frequently in your conversations?
Yes, definitely. And to be honest, I think sometimes this happens naturally with a war that now everybody laughs and says, oh, I can't believe they thought they were going to take Kiev in 3 days. And I don't actually think it's absurd as it seems. The idea that's absurd is that they could hold Ukraine or occupy Ukraine because clearly Ukrainian attitudes towards Russia and towards their own future and self-determination had changed dramatically since 2014. However, if we look back, and Jack Watling and Sasha Daniluk have done some really wonderful work on this at RUSI. If we look back at actually, what was happening during that period, there's been a bit of distance. If the Russians had taken Hostomel Airport, the situation could really have been quite different. They came very, very close to Kiev. We're talking, a handful of miles away from the city center. They were, of course, in Kiev Oblast, in Kiev region, as we know from the awful massacres that happened in Bucha and other towns towards the north of the capital. So I think it's perhaps not as laughable as it may seem. Perhaps if Zelensky had been as weak as the Russians thought, that he sometimes, in general, I'm not a fan of the great man theory of history, but obviously every now and again you do have a leader who does just change history. And I think that if Zelensky had fled, this would have been, and there were plans for obviously governments in exile and offers of evacuation that were drawn up. And if he had taken them, I think we would be in an incredibly different situation. So there's that one point. But yes, people did see it as I suppose a pretty quick operation that they would get away with. And I mean, we saw this by the fact that, a lot of the troops who were sent were really administrators. They were administrative troops, that were there to administer the city, and incredibly a high proportion of them were killed.
I mean, this is a huge intelligence failure. I mean, do you think it's the equivalent of when, the Americans went into Iraq and they had essentially been talking to people that they thought were representative of Iraqi opinion, but actually these were people who had a sort of self-interest. Was it a similar situation with the Russians and, quote, friendly Ukrainians who were telling them something that basically wasn't true?
Yeah, it was quite similar, I think. You could definitely draw parallels. So firstly, there was an ignorance and a kind of deliberate arrogance, like one of arrogance, there are very few people in Russia. I mean, pretty much my understanding, though I'm happy to be corrected, but my understanding from somebody who knows more about these things than I do is that there were not any areas, within the FSB where you had people who were Ukrainian linguists who spoke Ukrainian, and really was like spoke Ukrainian and were real specialists in the country, because it was the sense of, but Ukraine is just Russian. So why would we need to study it? Which stands in really stark contrast to some of the specialism that you have in countries that Russia perceives as the real abroad rather than the near abroad. So that was one aspect of it, is they just weren't, they didn't engage properly. They didn't take their enemy seriously. And we know that General Zaluzhny, who's head of the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, he has studied his counterpart Gerasimov's writings. He kind of knows parts of them off by heart, and that's obviously served him well. I think it always serves you well to treat your opponent, to take your opponent seriously. So there's that aspect, but there's also another aspect, which is, I've been speaking to some people, particularly from Kharkiv, around this topic. So obviously there's a lot of corruption within the Russian system, and what you had were people with the Russian sort of like paying, the security services paying certain people, and creating these kind of circles that they felt were representative. And I mean, one of the issues is that everybody always thinks their views are kind of mainstream or centrist and kind of typical of what people in their region. So it may not necessarily have always been lying, but they were given a lot of money, some of these kind of people, collaborators, I think is probably the right term, and to help kind of build networks and whatnot. But my understanding is that a lot of these people spent the money on like jeeps, like taking ladies out and whatnot, and basically being a bit flash, and the money, well, quite clearly the money didn't go on creating networks. In some cases, this is really quite specific to Kharkiv, some of these details that I'm talking about, but I mean, in some cases it did appear to work, and we shouldn't underestimate that there are people who are still pro-Russian in Ukraine, and it often comes down to a matter of they don't want to part with that identity. They can't deal with the cognitive dissonance that might entail. And of course, you always have the cynical people who are doing it just for power or greed or whatnot. I suppose I think the main reason is they just did not expect. They underestimated Zelensky. They continue to underestimate Zelensky, and I think they overestimated how weak the West had become, and how incoherent, and also they just hugely underestimated how much Ukraine had really become, a coherent nation. And I think in some ways that goes back to Putin's misunderstanding of nationhood in general, which again I write about in the book, but he sees nation, in its primordial sense as an essence. And this is why you kind of get this real obsession with history, that there's this essence that continues throughout Russian history. It doesn't matter if it's the imperial, the Tsarist era, or it doesn't matter if it's the Soviet era or the post-Soviet era, you have this historical Russia. Whereas in actual fact, nations are continuously reconstructed. The idea of what a nation is, and say, for example, what Britain is, that's continuously reconstructed. The Britain, as I understand it, would be a very different Britain, to during Queen Victoria's time. And that's entirely natural and is often, a positive thing. And the same thing happened with Ukraine. It just, over time, it just constructed a really robust and coherent nation that's, I think, certainly a lot more robust than many nations in Western Europe.
Well, the second point you make about the war itself that really struck me was your observation that, quote, most diplomats and Ukrainian officials are not unduly bothered about Crimea. And you also say that before February 2022, they were even reluctant to retake the autonomous republic. So obviously, this is critical to how the war will end. Do you think it will end at the pre-2042 borders?
So, I guess there's one important thing here, that what officials and diplomats might think is not necessarily how the population thinks. And I think because of the nature and the intensity of the war being waged against them, it's probably quite important that Ukrainian popular opinion sees, I guess, total victory as the end result, because I guess psychologically it could become quite difficult to fight for, okay, we'll just get to here and then we can sit down, have some, that's not really, it's very difficult to gear yourself up for an existential battle where you're losing a lot of people, a lot of your best and youngest people, especially men, of course, for the sake of holding a few better cards at the negotiation table. It's just not a motivating factor. So I think there's that one aspect. I think it would be very difficult to sell that, as it were, to the Ukrainian people right now. And I think it would be a brave person who tried to do that, or a silly person. In terms of what I think is possible, I don't think that the war is going to end anytime soon. I don't think that Russia will be able to get the 4 territories plus Crimea that they insist that they've annexed. So I think that appears to be the basic minimum of what the Russians are putting out. And even still, if they did that, it would really just be for buying the time, because Russia, in its current kind of guise, is not going to accept Ukraine as a sort of politically independent state with its own sovereign choices. So there's that aspect. And of course, the Ukrainian side, I think in any discussion about how the war is going to end, I become unbelievably frustrated. So I can't imagine how Ukrainians feel by just the refusal to accept the agency of Ukrainians. And they are not, I guess the way they feel is it's not sort of a romantic, like, we'll fight on, it's just, we have to fight, because if we don't fight, then we don't exist. So, I guess from their point of view, is either way they die. So they have everything to fight for. So in terms of how the war will end, I set out a sort of idea for Western policymakers at the end around a notion of containment 2, like 2.0, where we support Ukraine to get back to its pre-24th of February 22 borders, plus even if it's just a hamlet, just as that kind of symbolic gesture that Russia has lost from doing this full-scale war and not gained, just in that most obvious territorial sense. And then we just move to a strong policy of deterrence, where we bring Ukraine into NATO. We do everything to protect Ukraine, and we turn Ukraine into this sort of 21st century West Berlin, and we focus in on ourselves and, use Ukraine's incredible sort of heroism really as a means to maybe kickstart what the West even means, and the commitment to values that, to be honest with you, had long started to sound like a not especially funny joke in the words of certain politicians. And I feel like Ukraine, I mean, I don't know how it is for people, but certainly for me, and I tend to be quite a dry sort of person, but I've found myself very inspired by the Ukraine. It sort of reminds me of something, sort of from literature almost. But yes, I don't know how, that said, to go back to being dry, I don't know how, I'm not sure how realistic that approach is. And also, I don't think that policymakers are necessarily, especially up for it. And that's why, I suppose, going back to your original question about sort of why write this book, I do think that if we promote this idea that it's just Putin's war, I'm not arguing against it because it's unfair. Yeah, it is unfair, but it's not the point. And I'm not arguing against it because I want to sit as moral judge or juror. I'm arguing against it because it makes for bad policy, because it misunderstands the situation. It misunderstands then what's possible.
Yeah. I mean, coming to Putinism itself, the regime, you seem convinced it will eventually collapse. And you say when it does collapse, it will be quick, unexpected, and probably miserable. What's your best guess as to how this happens and the shape it takes?
Absolutely as good as anybody else's guess, really. I think with these sort of, well, I mean, if we look at the data, we know that personalist autocracies of the type that Russia clearly is, we know that they are much more likely to descend into chaos and into quite into violent transitions. And I have to say, the proliferation of private military contractors, the proliferation of new security firms, and the exponential growth of crime, particularly violent crime in Russia, carries very disturbing echoes of the 1990s. And just as in the 1990s, you're going to have a lot of men sort of returning or traumatized from war, and you're going to have even more because even more men have died in this war than died over the 9 years of the Soviet Union's war against Afghanistan. So I don't, if we look at both the data, but also just maybe things you don't need data for, like it's not great if you have violent criminals who've then you've also been a bit traumatized by war, and loads of other people just traumatized by war. It's not a great setup for a transition to a nice kind of institution building and a nice liberal democracy, especially when there's a culture of denigrating these things because of very bad experiences in the 1990s. So I there's definitely scope for a positive approach, but some of the Russian liberal opposition, I think, are definitely not the answer. I mean, some of these congresses that have been going on, and where you see people talking about, ordinary Russian citizens, outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, it's like the dregs. It's sort of like yokels and idiots who just need to be reprogrammed. I mean, what a way to get someone to vote for you, right?
Yeah. Well, to close, because this is a podcast about books, as usual, I've asked my guests to choose two to recommend to listeners. Jade, what have you chosen?
So the first book is Boris Pilnjak's The Naked Year, or The Bare Year. It's sort of a semi-autobiographical fiction book, but it's about the Russian Civil War. And the author sort of travels around and he tries to use not only sort of his descriptive powers, but also, the structure, the form itself of the language and even the typography to convey just the horror and the chaos of war and its impact on the individual, which I think even, in some of my comments there, it's quite easy to overlook and to think of, heroic sacrifice. But of course, there's 100% that element in Ukrainian fighting, but also, it's just grim. It's just being in mud, and it's just an awful, awful experience. And I think in recognizing their heroism, we shouldn't forget the toll that takes that war takes on a human being.
Okay, and your second book?
My second book is Shaun Walker's The Long Hangover, which I mean, it was a very well reviewed and well received book anyway, but I still feel is sometimes underappreciated in terms of the books about Putinism, because it's a really wonderful exploration of the process of how history was made relevant, and also the extent to which there was a grassroots demand for this, for a need to feel proud after the perceived humiliations of the 1990s. And he does it in a really accessible and impressionistic way, and also with loads of puns around hangovers that are very clever. But as well, it's also excellent research. And I think for a very long time, if people ever ask me, what's the book, if I had to read one book to understand what's happening in Putin's Russia, I always used to recommend that book.
Right, great. Well, neither of those have been chosen before, so thank you for that. Today I've been talking to Jade McGlynn about her Russia's War, published by Polity in March. Jade, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much.